Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Tonight, Congress shifts its focus to keeping the government funded. The work being done on Capitol Hill with roughly 30 legislative days to pass appropriations and avert a shutdown. And a more pressing deadline to pass President Trump's rescissions package by next Friday.
Plus, the Trump tariff fight turns political.
I think what we saw several months ago, now it's paused again happily, is the kind of broad-based industrial policy that I think ultimately will harm the American economy.
The tough words from the former vice president today as Trump wages a war of words with Brazil's leader, Lula, now pushing back against President Trump after his threat to slap 50% tariffs on all Brazilian goods. Trump suggesting a bigger political reasoning behind the hefty tariff. We'll have more on the trade fight where those long-promised deals are coming up.
Also tonight, the frank conversation Secretary of State Marco Rubio had with his Russian counterpart, seeking to express the president's disappointment with Vladimir Putin over his attacks on Ukraine. We'll have more on where things stand in the war and developments out of Israel with former NATO Supreme Allied Commander and retired four-star Air Force General Philip Breedlove up ahead.
And the president's birthright citizenship executive order blocked again. The determination in court today that reinstated protections put on hold by the Supreme Court last month. And what happens next in one of the president's signature policy moves?
We've got all that, plus a Bloomberg scoop for you tonight. Nvidia's Jensen Huang meeting with President Trump at the White House today ahead of the CEO's trip to China.
Now on the offense with global leaders as the administration issues tariff demand letters. In total, 22 letters have been delivered so far, igniting negotiations with some nations and a political standoff with others. Bloomberg's Mike Shepard and Romaine Bostick are on hand to discuss both the political and market implications of it all. We start right now with Mike Shepard here in our Washington, D.C. bureau with more. Mike, learning about this meeting between Jensen Huang and President Trump tells us a lot about where we may be going next with export controls and so forth. What is his ask for the commander-in-chief?
You know, it's unclear what his ask is. We've been able to confirm that the two men met. And what you see in private from Jensen Huang and get a sense from him is not different from what you see in public. He has argued on behalf of Nvidia against a lot of the export restrictions that the U.S. has put, primarily against his company when it comes to selling advanced AI chips to China. And the idea for the U.S. government is one that's driven by national security motivations. They want to prevent China from taking those AI chips and putting them toward military uses, possibly. The whole dual use question that surrounds a lot of advanced technology. But Jensen's argument has been, and it's been consistent for months, that those export controls don't work, and they also risk putting his company and the U.S. and American technology at a disadvantage to Chinese competitors, especially Huawei Technologies, which is developing its own vanguard of AI chips and trying to roll them out and perhaps trying to steal what could be U.S. market share in some other places around the world, Joe.
So Nvidia, obviously an example of a company who is trying to navigate what is a very complicated and uncertain situation around export controls. Meanwhile, you have companies and, frankly, countries across the board trying to navigate what is a very uncertain environment when it comes to tariffs. We didn't get any new trade letters from the president today, Mike, though he has suggested more are coming, and there's no deals that we have yet in hand in addition to the ones that we already knew about.
You're right, Kelly. There's only a handful of deals that have actually been signed, sealed, and perhaps delivered, and even the details of those remain a little bit obscure and thin in the eyes of many economists who specialize in global trade and have gone through years and years of rounds of previous accords like USMCA, to just name one. What we're seeing now is this waiting period now until August 1st. And so many countries are under pressure to deliver some sort of concession to the U.S. to reach some sort of understanding with the Trump administration to avert much higher tariffs. And a great example of that, of course, is Brazil. They were hit yesterday with an eye-watering 50% level. And that came with a little bit of political topspin, as we were discussing right at the top of the show. The president of Brazil, leftist leader Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, he has viewed what the Trump letter contained as very much a political message. And Donald Trump was singling out Brazil for a much higher rate because he thinks that Lula's predecessor, former right-wing President Jair Bolsonaro, has been treated unfairly by the Brazilian judiciary. He is now facing charges there for attempting to foment a coup. And this is all adding up to a different element altogether in trade negotiations. It's not just about economics and trade. Perhaps it's also about politics, too.
All right, Bloomberg's Mike Shepard, thank you so much, as always. Now, the president today was crediting his policies for fresh records in the stock market, posting on Truth Social, quote, tech stocks, industrial stocks, and NASDAQ hit all-time record highs, crypto through the roof. Nvidia is up 47% since Trump tariffs. And joining us now for more context is Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine, should we be characterizing this as a market that's rallying because of tariffs or in spite of them?
Probably a little bit of both, Kelly. I think the idea that Trump is at least trying to get at is that some of his policies maybe have cleared the way for this rally that we've seen. But of course, this is a rally coming off of a huge drawdown that we saw in U.S. equity markets back in April that were also due directly to his policies. So what he's stating there is true. The S&P, yes, indeed, did close at a record high on this day. Industrial stocks, not quite at a record high, but only about a percentage point, less than a percentage point from achieving that record high. You saw that reflected today in the Dow Industrials, the Dow Transports, as well as in another index tracked in the S&P 500 that includes a lot of the airline stocks. So there is some optimism in this market, not so much that his policies are helping, but that the negative effect of those policies is not going to be as bad as some people had priced into this market just a couple of months ago.
Is this a rally that's broadening the way we tend to hear about, Romaine? I'm supposed to ask you about the broadening of the rally, the rotation into value, or is it the same 4 or 5 stocks pushing these indexes to new highs?
Pretty much the same 4 or 5 stocks, Joe. I mean, I hate to break it to you, but when you look at the big rally that we've had off of those April lows, I mean, most of those gains still are the big tech companies, your Microsofts, your Amazons, and of course, Nvidia. You guys were just mentioning Nvidia a while ago with Jensen Huang apparently being seen entering into the White House ahead of his big China trip. That remains an 800-pound gorilla in this financial market, and it remains the big part of the reason why stocks overall are at record highs. Do you want a broadening of this rally, Joe? Well, in order to get that, you need to see a lot of those smaller companies, the companies in the Russell 2000, the companies in the S&P 400 mid-caps, start to post more meaningful gains when it comes to their earnings. And these are the companies that are most directly affected by a lot of Trump's policies, whether it's the direct effect from tariffs or the second order effects on economic activity. Those are the companies, and more importantly, the stocks that are still struggling. Those are the stocks that are nowhere near their record highs. So if you do get a broadening of those into those names, that's good for the market. If you don't, then maybe we can see this market range bound for a considerable time.
Really important. We're always lucky to have Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick and his view from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine, thank you. Joining us now for more insight into the global economic impact and the market impact of these tariffs, Christopher Smart, founder, managing partner of the Arbroath Group. Christopher, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. What do you make of the S&P 500, the NASDAQ hitting all-time highs against the backdrop of this extreme uncertainty that we keep hearing about when it comes to trade and tariffs? Is this a market that's just grown numb to this idea, or is it the ultimate taco?
Well, Joe, good to be with you. I think, you and your colleagues have covered the taco trade inside and out for the last few weeks. I'm not sure if Trump always chickens out. I mean, you'll have to ask folks in Iran or even importers of Chinese goods, which are facing stiff tariffs right now. But it's clear that this market doesn't believe all of the posts on Truth Social that we're getting from the president, or indeed his statements about whatever tariffs are going to be coming online. I think what's interesting today compared to April 2nd or whatever Liberation Day was, it feels like many, many years ago, not many months ago, but the uncertainty around the Trump trade policy is almost as high as it was back then. We had always been hoping, I think investors that I talked to have always expected that by now we weren't going to get all of these deals that he had promised, but we'd get some sense of what parameters made sense, what qualified as a good deal in the president's mind. but drawing any lessons from the partial framework that has been concluded with the UK or the little bits and pieces we know about what's been done with Vietnam, it's really hard to know what's going to cross the finish line. And so while the negotiations continue, I think what the market is telling you is that, we're going to be in this world of uncertainty. But as Romaine just said, the negatives of the tariffs that are expected may not be as painful as we might have thought back in April. But we're also certainly not expecting the top lines that he's promised to follow through.
Well, not as painful, Christopher, on the inflation front either, at least not yet. You aren't seeing it reflected in higher prices or higher price data, which is why the president keeps pushing this idea that the Fed should be in a position now to cut rates. But the Fed Chair, Jerome Powell, has suggested he expects the tariffs to actually start showing up this summer, potentially next week in the CPI report. Is that also your expectation?
I think we'll get the beginnings of some signs of tariffs in the inflation numbers. I mean, you have to remember that, companies have been bracing for these tariffs for a while, and they've been buying a lot of extra inventory to be able to avoid tariffs if they could. And now many of them, particularly the smaller ones that are traded on the stock exchange, are being forced to pay some of those prices. But again, it's going to be company by company and sector by sector as to which companies have been forced to push through some price increases and others that are going to still try and hold off. The other piece that's important to remember, I think, for all of our attention on tariffs, imports to the U.S. represent roughly around 13-14% of GDP. And only a smaller portion of that are covered by tariffs so far. So it's going to be visible, but not necessarily prominent.
Okay, so if we froze the game right now and actually we're stuck with all of the rates that have gone out in these letters, 25% Japan, up to 50% in Brazil, what would be the reading on inflation a year down the road?
Well, I think that's the hard thing to predict because, as the president and his team will tell you, a one-off increase in a tariff in itself is not inflationary. That's prices get adjusted, currencies adjust one way or the other. What is inflationary, I believe most economists will tell you, is the trade war, the threat of retaliation, and you get a world in which people just always expect prices to go up because of a tariff or a counter tariff or the uncertainty of a tariff. And that's what drives up expectations in the surveys. And that's what makes the Fed, I think, more nervous than a one-off. If the president were imposing these tariffs and they were fixed and we knew what they were going to be, you could probably figure out how to absorb that shock from the Fed's perspective. But it is this uncertainty, I think, that is making them more wary of cutting too quickly.
And yet the president is still suggesting that the Fed funds rate is 3 points too high. Not sure we're going to see 300 basis points in cuts materialize anytime soon. Christopher, as we consider, though, that part of what the president argues he needs the Fed to cut rates for is because our interest burden is so high, it would greatly bring down the costs and the amount of spending that we need to do on interest specifically if the rate were lower. How should we be considering that element of this as we think about the longer term fiscal health of the United States, having just passed a long term budget reconciliation bill that will have implications for years to come?
Well, I think that's the other big piece of news that you have to remember when you look at this stock market, right? You have the bill that is passed. We now know what tax rates will be for different companies. It is a marginally, I would argue, stimulative bill going into next year. And, I think there is this expectation that that is going to support economic growth, even as you get a headwind from tariffs. But I think clearly on a much longer term view, investors are going to be looking at the sustainability of the U.S. debt. It particularly gets tricky as the price of debt rises. And as you say, that's why the president is focused on bringing interest rates down. I still think, fundamentally, as long as investors believe that the U.S. economy is the most creative and dynamic in the world, people will buy our debt. But it's going to be at a probably higher cost than the president would like or than even the Fed might like.
What's the most important deal that the White House could present between now and August 1st, in your view, Christopher? Is it India, or do all roads lead back to China?
Well, I don't expect. Well, India might get done, and that would be a good thing. Although the rumors of it getting done have been going on for some time now. The biggest deal to be done is with Europe. It is, the largest investor in the United States. It is the largest economic relationship with the United States, and the uncertainty around that continues. And what's particularly difficult is that from the European side, they need to get the approval of 28 different countries. It's not just a guy sitting in the Oval Office who can sign off on one side. You really have to bring along a lot of the Europeans, and they have a diminishing tolerance, I think, from some of these threats that the president has made right now. So I think what I hear is that we're close, but that's going to be the big one from the market, from the economic perspective.
All right, Christopher Smart, founder and managing partner of the Arbroath Group. Thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, the Justice Department has opened criminal investigations into former FBI Director James Comey and former CIA Director John Brennan. We'll bring you those details. But first, Secretary of State Marco Rubio meets with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to discuss the war in Ukraine. We'll have more with retired Air Force General Philip Breedlove, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
My deep conviction is Vladimir Putin doesn't want peace. Vladimir Putin wants Ukraine. I sense that my old running mate is coming around to recognizing Putin's real intentions here. It's in the interest of our country. It's in the interest of our allies in the region, and long-term peace in Eastern Europe for us to continue to provide military support to Ukraine, to put punishing sanctions on Russia until a just and lasting peace can be secured.
Former Vice President Mike Pence here on Bloomberg TV and radio earlier today, discussing the war in Ukraine and President Trump's recent tone shift around it. Joining us now on Balance of Power with his analysis, retired four-star general for the U.S. Air Force, Philip Breedlove. He's also former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe and a distinguished professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. General, thank you so much for being here. As we consider that we have seen a bit of a shift from President Trump, much more willing to criticize Vladimir Putin, obviously reversing the Pentagon's prior decision to pause aid for Ukraine, knowing how prone he has been to reversals in sentiment on this subject. Do you expect that it changes Putin's calculus at all, at least in the near term?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. We are all happy to see our president begin to truly understand and embrace the problem that Putin presents. And we're all very, very happy that the president is beginning to change his tact. Do I think it's going to change Mr. Putin? I don't. Mr. Putin does not want peace. He's not a partner in the way ahead on Ukraine. Mr. Putin wants to take Ukraine and subjugate his people, and that's all he's interested in.
General, it's great to have you here. There is reporting that American-made weapons have resumed the shipments to Ukraine after the interruption that we reported on, an interruption that was apparently not signed off by the president here. Apparently now artillery shells and mobile rocket artillery missiles are now being provided to Ukraine, but they need more than that. And I wonder, what is the most important item we can provide now? Is it Patriot missiles?
Well, Joe, I hate to disappoint you. The most important thing we can deliver right now for Ukraine is a solid, loud, proud, public declaratory policy that says to Mr. Putin, you will not win this war. We are going to support Ukraine until you stop this senseless war. Remember, this war is completely at the creation of Mr. Putin. It is inhumane, it is illegal, and it is immoral. And so most important would be for the Western world, and especially the United States, to be very straightforward. You will not prevail in this war. After that, lots of things we can discuss on weapons. But Mr. Putin needs to know he's not going to win.
Would Congress passing and the president signing a stricter sanctions package as is currently being discussed go at least some way towards sending that message, General?
It would, and I really believe that we should continue the sanctions because they are having some effect on Russia, on the Russian people, on the Russian economy. But sanctions have never changed Mr. Putin's approach to the battlefield, and that's the most important thing we need to do now. We need to change his approach to the battlefield.
A year ago, General, and I remember hearing commentary from you at the time, there was a big debate about whether the U.S. should provide F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. Our viewers and listeners should know that you are a fighter pilot and you flew F-16s for the better part of 20-plus years. Was it worth it in the end? Did it have an impact?
Well, first of all, yes, it does have an impact. It is important to note that we have given them no U.S. F-16s. The United States has not given Ukraine a single F-16. The U.S. okayed our allies to give Ukraine F-16s. I think it's time that we in the United States should look to some of ours that are sitting in the desert and that we should consider giving them actual U.S. F-16s.
Well, beyond the F-16s, though, General, when we think back to the pause we were discussing a moment ago, the initial concern was that the U.S. just doesn't have enough to share, frankly. Our defense industrial base is not able to produce at such a capacity that we can afford to deplete ourselves so much in the name of defending Ukraine. How do you think about that calculus, or rather providing Ukraine with the means to defend itself?
Well, Kaylee, it's a tough subject. Clearly, when we offer things to Ukraine, they are no longer available to us. But if you look at the dynamic of what the United States has done so far, we have given them our older kit. In some places, kit that we were getting rid of. And in one case, kit we were going to have to spend a lot of money to demilitarize. We have given them all of those things. And so the impact to our true fighting capacity is there, but it's not as much as it would seem because much of this kit we were phasing out to begin with.
General, how do you fight a war against an enemy that follows no rules? Ukraine is targeting military installations. Russia is targeting civilians and anything else that it can bomb.
This is a point that very few Americans understand. It's, as I said a few minutes ago, this is an illegal, inhumane, immoral war. Russia is shooting indiscriminately into the spaces where normal people live. Remember the stories early of Mariupol, where Russia bombed the maternity hospital, and then as the women and children were leaving the maternity hospital, they bombed the women and children as they left. This is a war criminal leading an illegal war, and the world needs to understand that. And then what we see Ukraine doing is because they have so few weapons to waste, they are very discriminate in what they bomb. You watch the great story of the takedown of all their bombers deep inside Russia. This is a country that is fighting a legitimate war. We call it a counter-force war.
Mm-hmm. A sobering take from retired four-star general for the U.S. Air Force, Philip Breedlove. It's great to have you, General. Come back and see us again. He's former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe with us on Balance of Power. Coming up, we turn our attention to the impact of President Trump's tariffs on farmers. An important conversation with Tom Vilsack, the former Secretary of Agriculture in the Biden administration, will join us next as the administration tries to balance funding for farmers with its crackdown on immigration. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
There's already been $100 billion collected in tariffs, and it has not really adversely affected the economy. The estimates are that total will get to around $300 billion by the end of the year. $300 billion on a full year basis is a little over 1% of our economy.
Wilbur Ross, former Commerce Secretary during the first Trump administration, this morning on Bloomberg discussing the revenue generated by tariffs. And joining us now here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio with more of the state of play of tariff policy itself, Adam Farrar, senior geoeconomics analyst for Bloomberg Economics. So, Adam, obviously this week we have gotten 22 letters from President Trump to the leaders of various countries, tariffs ranging from 20% up to 50% in the case of Brazil. Yet nothing new today, and still no deal announcements, even though he's characterizing these letters themselves as a deal. What does that suggest about where exactly we are as we get closer to August 1st?
So I think you're keying in on the reality of our situation is that these letters in many ways are to some extent a distraction. As you highlighted, most of them are just a reiteration of the April 2nd tariffs, and in some cases obviously with some movement up and down, but overall even across the board. And more importantly, the big takeaway from this week was that July 9th came and passed, and that August 1st is our new date. And for all those countries that were rushing over the weekend, sending their trade ministers, making their phone calls, they had the opportunity to breathe a sigh of relief and try and push those negotiations out to really find something of substance they can latch onto.
So are we to believe that a series of conversations started after this new deadline emerged and the letters went out? Has this actually changed anything?
I think the answer simply is that the conversations have continued, right? The countries that were negotiating, Bloomberg assesses that number to be somewhere between 18 and 23, depending on how we count it, are still negotiating. And they're using this time to try and get something across the board that both addresses the Trump administration concerns and gives them something they can take home to their domestic populations. And the one thing I'd flag there is this big question, this outstanding question of sectoral tariffs, and whether the administration is willing to give enough for countries like Japan, South Korea, and the EU that need something in that space.
Well, and for like South Korea and Japan, autos specifically in terms of sectoral tariff, I would imagine is a concern. But we also learned officially from the president overnight that August 1st is when that 50% copper tariff will be going into play. Do you expect that we could see carve-outs for copper-producing countries like Chile, or that we could see tweaks to that policy overall, know how critical that commodity is?
I think the simple answer is that we should expect that anything is possible at this point. He's given, again, a runway for conversations. There's been ample reporting over the last 24 hours highlighting the essential nature of copper to the technology industry in the United States, and the simple reality that demand is inelastic, right? People are going to need to buy it regardless of the price. And so if there are no changes, we're going to see price increases in the United States on key goods.
Adam, great to have you. Adam Farrar, Bloomberg Economics, here on Balance of Power. We appreciate the insights, and joining us now for a look more at how the agriculture industry is watching President Trump's tariff policy, along with other policies impacting farms out of this White House, is Tom Vilsack, the former Democratic governor of Iowa, former Secretary of Agriculture in both the Obama and Biden administrations. He's also the CEO of the World Food Prize Foundation. Governor, great to see you, and welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. President Trump, we'd like to start with the tariff matter, says that this is, in fact, good for business for American farmers. How do you see it?
Well, it's a mixed bag. To the extent that there are agreements that open up opportunities and markets for American agriculture, that's good news. But the reality is that right now that's not necessarily the case. With corn prices, for example, under $4, soybean prices under $10, I think it's a reflection and indication of a market that has quite a bit of surplus in it. And there has to be a place for it to go. And right now, it does not have a place to go. Our big client is China, and I think we're all waiting to see what ultimately ends up in terms of the agreement with China, if there is to be one, and then whether or not China will actually follow through with the agreement. We had a phase one agreement during the first Trump administration that China never actually met the goals or requirements of that agreement. And I think that's something to remember. These are agreements. These are not trade pacts that are essentially approved by Congress. These are one-off agreements that oftentimes countries make the decision not to follow. And that was certainly the case in China.
Well, of course, Governor, to have agricultural goods to actually export, you have to have those agricultural goods harvested and grown, and it requires workers to do that. So I also want to ask you about the president's immigration policy, as we have the current agriculture secretary, your successor, Brooke Rollins, suggesting that people who need to work in order to receive Medicaid, able-bodied Medicaid recipients, should replace the migrant farm workforce. Sir, is that even possible in terms of the numbers required? Is that the solution here?
Well, we're talking about several 100,000 individuals who work extremely hard on farms across the United States, primarily in the specialty crop dairy areas in particular. The reality is that's not the answer. The answer actually is immigration policy that essentially acknowledges the important work that these farm workers do and a pathway for them to continue to do it. The Farm Worker Modernization Act was proposed several years ago, was passed by a Republican House. It had probably more than 50 votes in the U.S. Senate. It just couldn't get to 60 votes. That would have provided a pathway, would have provided a responsibility on the part of these workers to acknowledge the wrongdoing, which would then not be amnesty. There would be a fine involved. There would be taxes that would have to be paid. There would be a period of time that they would receive a visa, if you will, to be able to work. It seems to me that that's a better course of action than to suggest that somehow magically folks who are currently on Medicaid will be in a position to take these jobs. There may not be the geographic match between where the Medicaid folks are, the eligible folks are, and where the farm work is required. So I think at the end of the day, I think American agriculture would prefer to see a workable system that provides stability and assurances that there's going to be the workforce there.
Well, not to mention the automation and AI component that the secretary is suggesting here, Governor. I don't know how soon you think robots are going to be working in the fields, but I'm really glad that you mentioned the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. This is an H-2A program, a visa program that hadn't passed, to your point. Do you think it could ever see the light of day in this current political climate?
Well, I think it ought to. I think we need to get away from this the situation where all of the issues that we deal with are an either-or circumstance. And we need to get to a point where we look for the word and, where we essentially are able to resolve the concerns that folks have about amnesty, but to do it in a way that basically makes sense and basically provides the stability and workforce that American agriculture needs. I think the Farm Worker Modernization Act was certainly a starting point. The fact that it got a majority of votes in a Republican House, the fact that it had more than 50 votes in the U.S. Senate, would suggest that we're not far away from getting something done that would be, I think, accepted by most American agriculture, certainly the Western growers. There was actually a consensus between unions that represented farm workers and the growers, which you don't often see. So I think we should be encouraging that type of opportunity in order to meet this workforce need. AI, robots, absolutely, that's going to happen, but it's going to take time and there's expense involved in that. And that's going to make it a little bit more difficult for the small and mid-sized farming operations to continue to survive. And so I think we need to be cautious about how far that will solve the problem. I think we need a workable immigration system, and I think we all should be working towards that.
Well, that work may still lie ahead, as difficult it may be. Meanwhile, when we consider the work that this Congress at least now has behind it, of course, the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, with not just the changes to Medicaid, which we were referring to with these work requirements, but also changes to the SNAP program. And Governor, I wonder if you ultimately expect that to have an impact on America's agricultural industry as well.
Well, that's the interesting thing about SNAP. When we often talk about the changes to the SNAP program, it's often in the terms of the number of people that may ultimately lose their capacity to go into a grocery store and to be able to purchase additional groceries. So we focus on the people who are food insecure, as we should. But there are also rippling effects of this decision on farmers. When 20 cents of every food dollar that's spent at a grocery store ultimately ends up at a farmer and with a farmer, you're really talking about a reduction in farm income that results from any SNAP reduction or any lack of participation by folks in the SNAP program. You're talking about jobs that are connected. When people can't purchase more at the grocery store, the reality is they won't. They can't. So that means it doesn't have to be as much in the grocery store. And all of those are jobs in the supply chain. The fact that states are going to take on some responsibility here will also, I think, ultimately impact public education, public safety, the public health system. Why? Because state budgets are constrained today, asking them to take on this additional burden. That's going to make very tough choices in state legislatures and governors across the country. So there will be a rippling effect and impact of this. It's not just the impact on families who are struggling financially, but on farmers, on job seekers, and on folks who are having to put together a state budget.
Well, you have a unique view on that front as a former governor, the state's view of Washington here. And I wonder if you see nonprofits being the answer, like the World Food Prize Foundation that you run, in trying to make up the gaps that may have been left by this legislation.
Well, look, elections have consequences, and administrations have the right to make decisions that they feel are in the best interest of the country. The ramifications of this is that the federal government takes a step back and essentially reduces its role, does put the onus on the rest of us to step up. 1 out of 8 Iowans, for example, is food insecure. 1 out of 6 Iowa children are food insecure. The numbers across the United States are pretty significant in terms of the number of food insecure families in the country. If we're not going to provide the help and assistance through the federal government, then it's going to be food banks and pantries and nonprofits, as you say, that have an additional responsibility. And I think the challenge is, can we basically step up in a significant way and fill that void, or to what extent can we fill that void? And what are ultimately the consequences of not filling it? It's often said that if you don't feed people, you feed conflict. And I think there is a lot of truth to that. And that's not just true domestically, it's also true internationally as we look at the development programs that are being reduced.
All right, Tom Vilsack, former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture during the Biden administration, of course, also former governor of Iowa. Thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, New York City Mayor Eric Adams shares his frustration with former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo over the city's mayoral race. We'll bring you the details when we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. And here are some of the top stories we're following in today's Power Brief. President Trump's effort to limit automatic birthright citizenship has hit another legal roadblock. The executive order was once again temporarily blocked by a federal judge in New Hampshire, automatically reinstating protections that were paused last month by the Supreme Court. The judge also agreed to provisionally certify the case as a class action lawsuit representing all affected babies and parents. Trump's order would overrule 150 years of constitutional precedent by restricting citizenship to babies with at least one parent who is a U.S. citizen or green card holder.
President Trump has named Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy as the interim administrator of NASA. The announcement coming 2 months after the White House pulled his original nominee for the position, SpaceX astronaut and billionaire Jared Isaacman, who has close ties to Elon Musk. That whole incident coincided with the public falling out between Trump and Musk. Duffy's appointment comes the same day as Politico reported more than 2,000 senior NASA employees intend to leave the agency as part of the Trump administration's overall cost-cutting efforts.
And this morning on Bloomberg, Democratic New York City Mayor Eric Adams, who is running for re-election as an independent, slammed former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo for staying in the mayoral race and potentially splitting the vote, a move Adams says will benefit Democratic nominee Zohran Mamdani. Take a listen.
He created this scenario because he thought by doing so, he can force someone out of the race. Are you saying that
Andrew Cuomo created Mr. Mamdani's campaign?
He created this scenario that created an opportunity to divide the vote instead of being unified around Mamdani. This was his creation.
Former Mayor Michael R. Bloomberg, the founder and majority owner of Bloomberg News parent company Bloomberg LP, endorsed Cuomo in the primary and has contributed to his PAC. Joining us now with their reaction to this story and a lot more this evening's political panel. Let's get to it with Jim Kessler, Democratic strategist, Executive Vice President for Policy at Third Way, and Republican strategist Lisa Camuso-Miller, host of the Friday Reporter podcast, former RNC Communications Director. Great to see you both here. Jim, I'll start with you as our Democrat. New poll out today on the New York mayoral race. Not good for Eric Adams. This is a Slingshot Strategies poll. Adams in 4th place. Only 11% of those polled said they would vote for him in the general election if it were held today. What does he need to do?
Well, if both Cuomo and Adams are in the race, it's certain that Mamdani wins. But Mamdani could win even if it's just a one-on-one race out there, too. And Curtis Sliwa is in the race as well as a Republican who's going to take some votes. But if you want to stop Mamdani, Cuomo or Adams need to get out. I have a number one rule of politics, which is all elected officials are selfish, so it's hard for them to withdraw
They've both
from
asked
something.
each other to drop out.
That was
Adams,
very nice of them.
Revealed today. They're both still in the race.
Very generous of them.
Well, if we consider the prospect of Mamdani maybe being set up for a victory here, that's catnip for Republicans, right, Lisa?
Yeah, it's a pretty fun race for those of us who are political watchers to watch. It's also, to me, historic in that there have been now 3 mayors that have been elected in New York, de Blasio, Adams, and then whoever will be in the mayor's race, as an outlier, not someone that's your mainstream Democratic candidate that is the viable candidate for the job or ultimately wins. So it's fun to watch because I think New York is really, it's an outlier for so many of us who love to watch this. So it'll be interesting to see. I'm with Jim on both of those guys probably need to get out because otherwise it seems to me like the pathway to mayorship is already been paved.
As much as you love Curtis Sliwa, Republicans are secretly hoping Mamdani wins this race, so you can talk about him for the next 4 years, right? Donald Trump's talking about him every day already.
No question about it. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I remember Curtis Sliwa when he was in charge of the street group. Thank you, the Guardian Angels that were in New York from when I was a kid. But he's still very involved there. But yes, no. To me, it seems like this is an opportunity for political messaging, an opportunity for Republicans to point to what's not working if Mamdani is the ultimate winner in the mayor's race.
Well, I want to shift the focus from what's going on in New York City to what's happening currently here in Washington. On Capitol Hill today, the Senate trying to take steps in the appropriations process as we count down to September 30th and the expiration of government funding. Some of the appropriations bills advancing out of committee, and yet there's no deal yet between Republicans and Democrats for a bipartisan full appropriations package, and that's leading some to bet on just another continuing resolution. We spoke with Republican Congressman Chuck Fleischmann of Tennessee about that on the early edition of Balance of Power today.
If you look at where things are, we never want to see a government shutdown. I've lived through 3. It's not good. It costs more to reopen, and it just really is disadvantageous for the entire nation, including markets and the like. But what do I think will happen? The reality is you look at the clock and things like that, probably a short-term CR.
You both obviously have plenty of experience in this regard as well. Would you agree with that assessment that you're not going to get a deal by September 30th? You're just going to get another kicking of the can?
Yeah, I think a deal is unlikely because the last time the Democrats avoided a shutdown, those who led that avoidance paid a huge price. And that was Chuck Schumer, really took a lot of criticism on that. And I think that Democrats are going to be reluctant this time. So I think a deal in some ways is even harder than it was last time. So I do think a kick down the road we're going to see for a bit.
Well, part of the conventional wisdom is that a deal might be impossible if this rescissions package that is going before lawmakers now passes. How could Democrats trust Republicans if something that's already cleared Congress is clawed back? And we talked again on the early edition of Balance of Power with Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia about this. Here's what she had to say about the president's rescissions plan.
We are now looking at the details of the rescission package. It's a $9 billion package, mostly USAID, but also Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And we may make some adjustments there in terms of where we think this may have gone too far in some cases. And so we're in the process of that right now.
I'll probably get some tweets for asking this, but is $9 billion worth blowing the whole fiscal year budget over?
I think that the administration is looking for every opportunity to cut, and so that's what this is probably going to be. I also wouldn't count out this Republican leadership. I think over and over again we have doubted whether or not they could get bills done. Big Beautiful Bill was done by July 4. The Speaker himself has had a lot of wins in spite of the fact that he was someone that no one thought was a leader for that space. So as much as I think that it is unlikely and we'll be looking at a continuing resolution, I also think that conventional wisdom has me questioning whether or not any of what once was the case for the way government and Congress did their work is the same anymore. So there may be an opportunity here. I know the president will want a win, and he will want something other than a CR.
Well, certainly, and the president has shown that he is not willing, or he is not unwilling to use the executive office and the power within it and the influence he has in order to influence outcomes on Capitol Hill. But to this idea that Joe was talking about, Jim, of why would Democrats play ball in the appropriations process if rescissions are always at risk of looming in the aftermath? what cover does that provide them to potentially allow a shutdown to happen this time?
Right. And look, I also think that if you look at the grassroots of the Democratic Party, they want to fight, okay? They don't necessarily want to win. They want to fight. The fight is the win in and of itself. So I think that both there would need to be some assurances that there aren't going to be future rescissions if there's some sort of deal. And also Democrats in Congress who in the past chose fighting would need to say, OK, this time we're going to be cutting a deal. Otherwise, I think we're going to see something prolonged and ugly.
Well, you've been through this before a couple of times. As Kayleigh mentioned, Chuck Schumer knows this. He's had enough experience here to know better, doesn't he?
Yeah, but I think he also, look, I think Chuck did the right thing last time, and he paid a price. It hurt him politically, and I think he's going to say, okay, my caucus, a lot of Democrats spoke. I'm going to listen to them, even if it's not exactly what I think is the right move here. So we'll see.
What about in the House? Do you think the same applies for Hakeem Jeffries up against Mike Johnson?
You know, it's hard to say. There has been so much back and forth. To credit the House Democrats, they have been unified in just about everything they have done. And it has been really enviable to watch the way they stand together with one another. But I do think that this may fall down the lines where folks start to say, I'm not willing to give up the political capital. I need to do the right thing for my district, because we're getting very close to September, which is getting very close to 26, which is midterm season. And so I do think that we start to feel a lot more of the political vulnerabilities. And at that point, the House sometimes can operate very differently than the Senate.
Mike Johnson promised regular order. Will we see it with an actual budget that becomes law?
Well, I think that goes back to my original point, is that Mike Johnson has really wanted to demonstrate that he can get back to regular order, that he can do. I think that it is a very lofty goal, but I also do think that it ought not to be, and it's the way we used to do things way back when. However, I do think that there's some momentum and there's some wind behind him in the possibility of this being something that could be achieved, especially with the president also eager to see this happen in regular order.
All right, Lisa Camusa-Miller and Jim Kessler, our political panel on this Thursday. Thank you both so much for joining us as we come to the end of the week here, knowing tomorrow, Friday, Joe, is supposed to bring, at least according to President Trump, a visit to Texas in the flood-torn area of Hill Country, where, of course, there's still over 100 people missing in active search and rescue.
Yeah, this remains a developing story, even if it's not on front pages everywhere. And it's something that we're going to talk about a lot tomorrow, as the president decided to wait a few days following this tragedy so he wouldn't be in the way of rescue and recovery efforts, though we have yet to see an official schedule on that. If he does make his way to Texas, you'll hear about it and see it right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
And, of course, you can also find coverage of that, all of the other stories we talked about this evening in the Washington Edition newsletter, on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us. As always, on Balance of Power, we'll see you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.